Thank you very much. General plan is like 15 minutes to talk through roughly 30 slides, and then 15 minutes of just chatting about things. So this will be a very high level, fast click through of a lot of like first general motivation and then a bunch of projects. If you don't know about Protocol Labs, we started as a company building tooling and open source libraries for helping people connect two computers directly to each other and share that data in a peer-to-peer way that isn't based on where the data is stored, it's based on what the data is. So very useful for decentralization stuff. I lead the team that is now called Network Goods. Our goal is to engineer tools and opportunities for new coordination systems. And when I say revolutionary coordination systems, I'm thinking of things like this. Lots of different things you might want of a coordination system, but you could imagine that like at some point in time, all of these things were like invented. Like a year before they did not exist, a year after they were starting to have significant or potentially significant impact on how humans did things. And then they kind of quickly faded away into the background. And so it's like many of these, it's harder to think of them like the sit-in as a way of organizing people. Like that was basically, that was really like an invention that complements democracy really soundly. And we don't often lump it in the same bucket as like insurance or things like the metric system in terms of how groups of people come together to do things that they fundamentally kind of couldn't do before. I feel like this is very superfluous at Foresight with Foresight people, but like you can extrapolate from current trends. You can take comparisons between the fact that there are people in many countries who self-attest to using Facebook and WhatsApp. This is millions of people. I think it was specifically in Indonesia who said, I use Facebook, I do not use the internet. And then when you compare that to companies trying to take over next generation platforms, it should start getting wary, especially if you take into account that some of these next generation platforms have eye tracking, that it might include pupil dilation, and you might match this to like brain sensitivity data that you could run through some ML processor and plug into a new further world of surveillance capitalism, and could exercise creativity in ways that we may or may not understand or be able to predict. I love the metaphor that the Industrial Revolution, right, that automation may do to humans, not what the Industrial Revolution did to humans, but what the Industrial Revolution did to horses. I don't think that this is something that any individual person should be, or like, I don't think it makes sense to hold individuals responsible for these kinds of things. I love this reframing of Hanlon's razor that misunderstandings and lethargy produce perhaps more wrong in the world than deceit and malice do. At least the latter two are more rarer. I claim that people are following their local incentive gradient. You have a set of things that you can choose to do, and if that choice is between like go join a nonprofit and be unsure where you're going to get your next meal or your housing from, or go join a Wall Street bank, it's like you can expect the ensemble of humans to choose something that's going to map towards their incentive gradient, especially in facing future risk. No Raindrop feels responsible for the flood. The reframing of this that I even more prefer is, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. You are as much a victim as you are, well, you are not only a victim to the situation, to the system, you are also a part of the system. It is inescapable. There is no outside of the system when you talk about the global system. It's also weird to even talk about like we're headed toward potentially bad futures because of the global coordination systems we have, when it's not even clear what a bad future should be considered, like who gets to decide what a bad future is or a good future. Every person has some preferences over outcomes. If you want to take like 10 different people, want 10 different, like have 10 different metrics, and you want to collapse that down to one metric, this is a lossy mapping, which means that you will have to make subjective choices when you pick a mapping. This is like, that's a bit of an aside. This is also a bit of an aside. We think about building new coordination systems as really applied mechanism design. When we want people to, when we want better outcomes, there's game theory where you can look at the rules, identify strategies people might adopt from that, and identify the outcomes that might result from these strategies. Mechanism design is basically the inverse problem. As an example, with Filecoin, we said we want decentralized cloud storage. We want everyone to be able to participate in a market in the same way that you can with Airbnb and your spare room. You should be able to do this with file storage and your spare housing or your spare hard drive. We can set strategies and then set up rules that we launched as the Filecoin protocol. But you can do this with better coordination too. Like we want people to identify like research, like funding more risky research as that's the outcome. What's the strategy? What are the rules you set for this? As a result, Protocol Labs often uses this to justify the creation of protocols. But protocols aren't just like software communication protocols between computers. They can also be ways that people just make decisions, come to agreements, and come to like whether those are like general agreements or financial agreements, things like that. So I kind of so far named like ways people coordinate using technology, kind of motivated why there's no like objectively one perfect solution for this. But in terms of what my team and I are actually doing, we have 7 projects and a conference series, and combined, we're roughly trying to say like the most powerful engine for creating change has probably been, if you want to get specific, venture capital and capital markets. It's really easy to like fund new, like if you want a new thing to happen, venture capital does a really good job of identifying what the things. If you want something not to happen, governments are kind of your only option. But in terms of places to start, it seems like creating an analog for venture capital is interesting for things that are non-excludable. So private markets are really good at identifying needs for things, like needs for any physical object that like I can personally own and hold on to and keep you from having. Those are excludable goods. There are lots of things like public goods, commons, infrastructure, knowledge. These are things that everyone benefits from. Someone still kind of has to pay for them usually. Often that falls to governments, but it also can fall to church groups or unions or like community organizations. It seems like all of those are hyper local and there's nothing that's internet native. And so the thought becomes, could we build some tooling so that people can around the world across the internet come together and collaboratively build, support, foster, create more non-excludable goods. The rest of the talk is basically going through these one at a time in order. They will all these descriptions will be very brief. I have a link to the slides at the end, so you can take a picture of that and see all these later. And it has my contact info, so you can ask me questions too. I actually have no idea what my timing is. So, oh, okay. So five more minutes ostensibly if I want 15 minutes of questions. Hypercerts are the analog of equity. Equity is valued based on future cash flow traditionally. If you're creating non-excludable goods, then there is no future cash flow. So it should be valued at 0. But you could imagine a funding program where someone says, I want to see this good show up in the world. I will pledge that for work done between now and this point in the future, I will fund the team that succeeds at this goal and anyone who supported that effort in a portion that those individuals have agreed is fair. And what you basically created is the equivalent of a buyout of all equity. And you can imagine these kind of stacking if people want to multiply support this thing. This is bounties, this is X prizes, this is retroactive public goods funding, except for that, like this creates this gives value to something that is the contractual agreement of collaboration. Like with an X prize, it's the team that wins. And like you could create agreements, but our goal is to create tooling so you can very easily and dynamically create these agreements where you say, these are the contributions people made. And when we lump this together at the end, we say, this is the equity of our progress against this project, then the retrospective funder can support that all. You can use this to get support, either like logistically, financially, from prospective funders, and then ideally get them some return, get those initial investors and contributors some investment or some return on their initial investment. This will be launched as an NFT on the Ethereum main chain with interchain operability. So I think probably in January is our current timeline. If you have something that looks like equity, how do you then go and like empower multiple people to value it? Obviously, we say that like the price of a stock is the net present discounting of future cash flows, but like you can come up with a lot of different answers based on that one definition. You should also be able to do that for equity towards nonprofit goods. The impact evaluation is our kind of abstraction framework where we're going to give some heuristics on like, here's how we think you should value it, or here's how we would value it. Feel free to replace any of these pieces where you first identify a set of actions that you're interested in supporting, and then you identify what's like what concrete outcomes from those actions are interesting or valuable, or might be valuable, and then you evaluate, like express quantitatively the value of those, and then you can map those evaluations to a reward. This is intended to be a very, very generalized abstract framework where anyone can say like, oh, I don't like that, I'm going to replace this piece. But you can start doing things like either connecting this to smart contracts or automated deployment, or have like the work of, or this should be able to allow different nonprofits to collaborate where like one is really good at evaluation and the other is providing the reward. And so they want to provide that mapping, but you have this abstraction boundary that can allow clearer interfaces between these. If you are trying to fund, if you want to create the analog of venture capital, then it becomes really unclear what it would look like to, like you can't use a traditional venture fund to fund these things because you'd be in breach of fiduciary duty because you don't have the same expectation of return necessarily. So what does this analog look like? Corporations sell goods to, in a market and raise funding with debt and equity. We think you should be able to provide public goods in commons and raise funding with hypercerts as an analog. And in terms of, okay, we're missing the, we had created this entity archaeological that is the equivalent of a fiscal sponsor for these nonprofit entities. It's going to be like the host of these of the first few of these venture fund analogs, which we're calling network funds. An excludable good would be something where I can keep you from enjoying it. Public goods in common. So there's the typical matrix of, is it excludable? Is it rivalrous? And so walking around, it's excludable and rivalrous is a private good.
Excludable is a house, you can shut the door and keep somebody out. Excludable is something like the nuclear umbrella of the US, where if you're in the US, you would really have the nuclear umbrella, and it's often possible to say, we protect everybody but that guy.
Yeah.
Or basic science.
Yeah. Radio, groundwater, lots of like all the things that you like enjoy but can't sell, or like enjoy but can't keep others from. And like I don't really like the categories because you can move things around with technology or like social norms. You can also have I can have a rivalrous use of a good that infringes on, or I can have a non-rivalrous use of a good that infringes on your non-rivalrous use of the same good. So like me polluting into the water, anyone can pollute, but like you drink that water and me polluting keeps you from drinking it, even though you drinking it doesn't keep others from drinking it, unless you drink all of it, kind of thing. So like the categories are really fuzzy. They're useful when they're useful for like very scoped examples, but I use this because like people are usually familiar with public goods and commons, but it becomes very cumbersome to say public goods and commons, and I just use the general category of non-excludable goods, which is basically what it is. Yeah. I also want to include commons, which are rivalrous. Yeah. Public goods and commons are the non-excludable, rivalrous and non-rivalrous ones. So this is useful. I'm going to definitely, if I give an iteration of this talk, include that table at some point for clarity. So in addition to like creating this pipeline around how to fund public goods, there's also the like, what public goods do you want to create? We have this project called Discourse Graphs, which is a very general schema for describing the current state of a scientific problem. We've spent a lot of time thinking about scientific progress and how to improve it. The nice thing about this is nobody can kind of agree on what tool they want to use for sharing, like taking and sharing notes. But as a schema, you should be able to import across these. And we have, I think there's about 300 different discourse graphs that have been created in the last year or so since we funded the first tool to generate this. And we didn't come up with this idea. You can also find strong historical precedent for things that are similar. But we think that this could be something that we could use to create I claim it's immediately and continuously open science, and I like the idea that it extrapolates from papers to preprints to something that is even faster and even more open. We're very interested in expanding this model from things that are currently happening in science, like existing questions and evidence, to future things. You'll also notice in the same way everyone has their notes, own practice for taking notes. Everyone has their own practice for road mapping. And we think that I'm interested in collaborating with Foresight and figuring out how we could, what the fundamental schema you would want in order to do some of this merging. What's very interesting is that this is going to seem very disjoint at first, but Git is our best, well, maybe I can connect in two ways. If you have a roadmap, you're going to want to use the best way we have of version tracking and collaboratively generating knowledge. This is Git, and currently Git is forkable autocracy. One or a small number of people basically have complete control over it, but anyone can take it and make their own copy of it. And it seems like you might actually want something that is in between that, where you can vote and come to consensus around things. So we're building a plugin for Git, or an extension for Git, that will be added as an extension for GitHub. We have Glenn Weil and Audrey Tong, who want to write a book on pluralism or plurality using this tool and writing it on GitHub. That said, it also seems like it should be very useful for roadmaps. There's also a very interesting connection between arrows and possibility theorem, which says that for three very reasonable definitions of fairness, properties of fairness you would want, you can actually show that you can't have ordering, you can't have a global ordering, objective ordering of options. Orderings of options are directed acyclic graphs. Roadmaps are also directed acyclic graphs. And as a result, the same kind of governance problems that you would face for any kind of election is also going to be exactly the same problem you face in terms of building a roadmap. But as I was saying previously, it's, oh, okay, thank you. Almost great. Any aggregated preference requires subjective choices. The best thing we can do is make it easier to make those subjective choices clear. So that's governance for Git. Funding the Commons is our conference series. We've had 5 of these so far, 2 of them virtual. We're planning on having 8 or so in the coming year. Some of them virtual. They have been very stimulating conversations like this of bringing people together to talk about how to create more public goods and commons, particularly systemic changes. What are things you can learn about practices that you can bring back to the communities you're part of and modify those properties? These projects roughly map to these kind of categories. It's not one-to-one or onto, but I could draw the lines if I had time. They are a set of puzzle pieces that fit together to be one cohesive thing, but they should all also independently function. And I'm going to move this so that you can get, try to move that. That's a link to the slide deck. So with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with VitaDAO, maybe as a way to try to
yes.
make some of these things alive a little bit?
So specifically, we have a project with a collaboration with VitaDAO. When you have hypercerts, this is a 3-sided marketplace. You need prospective funders, people who are going to undertake activity and retrospective funders. And implicit in this diagram, you need people who can evaluate what a good direction is and what good progress is. We have a program with VitaDAO where actually, Carl, you probably have more details on specifics than I do. So $5 million in retrospective funding that's the goal for, and the timeline is Q1 or Q2. He's on the HyperSearch team, so. Oh, actually. So the idea, when I was saying expanding it, I was specifically saying discourse graphs are intended to be used for science that is currently ongoing. And so this is like an example of you see evidence and claims and questions here, and the sources that are contextualizing those claims. Anyone should be able to read this, contribute to it. There are research groups where instead of getting a stack of papers, the PI uses a discourse graph and just gives you access and says, like, read through this, add the questions you have, read some of the sources if you want to see the context of these claims. And this works very well for keeping a group on the same page about what's currently being considered within the lab. We're interested in extending this into future speculative research. What could, if this research goal were achieved, what could you do with that? And so I think the next talk in this spot is Adam Marblestone after the break. And the focused research organizations are perfect examples of this is something that is large that we're trying to do. We've talked a lot with Adam about these kinds of roadmaps and think that having a schema that could work between FROs or between an FRO and other organizations would be very compelling to be able to empower planning in the same way that the semiconductor roadmap allows for basically the entire industry to identify how they're going to, with many different corporations, achieve the next year's milestones.
Unfortunately, Adam is not coming.
Oh no. Okay.
Then I suppose, sure. With research, you might think there's also just some objective version of
Yeah, and Arrows also assumes independence between candidates, which roadmaps obviously don't have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a slightly pedantic question, but just there's mechanisms for deciding you might be able
I'm very interested in learning more about, this is a connection that I only made, I think, a week ago. And so I haven't done nearly as much digging into social choice theory as I would like. I know that there is, I saw somewhere that there was a way of sidestepping, cardinality voting might sidestep one of the assumptions of Arrows, and I don't actually yet understand, I haven't had the time to put into understanding why that is or which particular assumption that is. So I'd love to discuss that later. Hopefully we'll come across additional connections. I just also realized, Tom, was that the information you were interested in regarding VitaDAO? John?
It's sort of your other point, though, triggered one idea, which is that one way to evaluate the impact of a discourse graph would be what's the rate at which a new member of the research group becomes elected.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that would be pretty easily, I guess there might be difficulty in identifying how to define productive, but I think that's like even just quantifying the subjective and saying like this person at like 90 days in is 4 out of 5 points per productive, and like have the capacity to say like this person is 6 out of 5 productive, rounds that out a lot. John?
Obsidian, the best way?
Yes, we have Obsidian, Rome, Notion, and there is, and by we I mean like the community. People are implementing tooling for LogSeq, and these are the ones that are in progress. There have been other proposals of like, I would like to do it for this. Currently, you can only view, like this is tooling for facilitating the creation of and viewing of discourse graphs, like coloring and things like shortcuts. We are also in the process of figuring out how to have some like application independent data store, probably using IPFS, one of the protocol labs storage protocols, so that you can easily ingest other people's discourse graphs and be able to, as I think we should eventually be able to do, like all of my other collaborators use Obsidian, but I use Rome, kind of thing, or like that should be seamless to the extent that like the schema is what you and your collaborators agree is the only salient parts of this game.
And it's somewhat related to the previous talk on charter skills. If you think about people funding, individual funding, a lot of these things are funding.
Yeah, so hypercerts are in particular I think that this is a really interesting example of separating what do we want to have happen, which is the retrospective funding, from what gets us there. And what gets us there, as I said, markets are a really good way of identifying how to accomplish a thing, what is valuable. And so this is creating or facilitating a market for that. When it comes to the retrospective funding of what is valuable, that's something where democracy, I think, is probably our best goal. I think that this is most compelling when governments are using this to fund things that the people want. That said, as a tool for funding, you have to cater to whoever is providing the funding. And so to some extent, and this is because power is intrinsically regressive. If you have power, the more power you have, the easier it is to generate more power. Same with reputation, same with money. And so if the goal is to fund more public goods and commons, then what you need to do is make it easier for people with money to fund public goods and commons to the extent that they want it. And I want to empower people to have good governance and come together as government-like entities, whether that's a token community, like maybe that's the Ethereum community. I have a great claim that the Ethereum community has demonstrated legitimate use of force from like a political theory perspective historically. And so I think that there are government-like entities that should be doing most of the retrospective funding, but the fastest movers, the best experimenters are always going to be high net worth individuals, people who can are willing to experiment, and then quickly thereafter endowed nonprofits and foundations who are already mission aligned with a goal, and you're just empowering those goals.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you all for coming.
Please, Mark.